Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to be talking about a man that I like to consider Thomas Jefferson's first disciple, or the first member of the Jefferson family. And this person is William Short. Now, Thomas Jefferson took a lot of young men under his wing and they went on to become great founders. We know James Madison was Jefferson's right-hand man for a while, and then he took over for Jefferson as president. And James Monroe was Thomas Jefferson's right-hand man for a while, and he took over for Madison as president. And those two men also had a lot of other contributions to the American founding. William Short's name is not very well known nowadays, but he was actually the first one to really, wasn't the first one to meet Jefferson, but really work under Thomas Jefferson. So William Short graduated college, and he was a very distant relative of Jefferson. They probably knew of each other ahead of time, but as soon as he graduated college, William Short began working as Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary. So this includes, almost immediately, when Jefferson was governor of Virginia during the Revolution, and then he stayed with Jefferson when his wife passed away, and then Short even accompanied Jefferson to France when he was minister to France, and he spent 5 years there with Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson returns to the United States to become Secretary of State, and William Short remains around and is appointed Charge d'Affaires, I believe it's pronounced, which isn't minister, but it's similar. It's like a sub-minister he works mostly with the Americans there as opposed to the government, but he did, of course, as the only highest-ranking representative of the United States in revolutionary France, he was the go-to guy when you needed to communicate with the Americans for about 3 years. Now, Jefferson would return home. We forget, Thomas Jefferson was in France when the French Revolution broke out. He left almost immediately after, but he left, and Jefferson famously was a fan of the French Revolution. Short stayed long enough to see the French Revolution dissolve into the Reign of Terror, and had a very different opinion of what was happening than Jefferson and Madison would. Now, after about 3 years, Gouverneur Morris arrives, and he had been appointed the new minister to France, and he takes over for William Short. But with him, he carries a note and says, "Here, William Short, guess what? George Washington just appointed you minister to the Netherlands." Now, while that seems like a demotion, and in a way it was, France, Great Britain, and Spain were really the major powers of Europe at the time. It's very important to remember that Netherlands, although it's a small country, had very deep pockets. You know, I'll remind you that one of the companies that we didn't want to pay taxes to was the Dutch East India Company. And New York, even though it was 100 years before the Revolution, was once New Netherlands. And New York City was New Amsterdam. The Netherlands were very important. John Adams had gone there during the Revolution looking for loans for the United States. So this is actually it is a promotion from charge d'affaires to minister. So Short does that for about a year, and then returns to the United States, where he doesn't do a whole lot. He advises Jefferson and other politicians, but he had made many investments throughout his life and was able to live wealthily based pretty much strictly on investments he had made over time. So, you know, I did skip over, before he came home, he went to Spain for a year, where he tried to negotiate a treaty. Unfortunately, that didn't work out until Thomas Pinckney replaced him, and Thomas Pinckney, whose name I can never say right, Thomas Pinckney finished that negotiations and created the Pinckney Treaty. So I did want to mention that he also was a minister to Spain for about 2 years, I believe. Anyway, William Short comes back to the United States, and he gets in a little bit of a quarrel with James Madison, who has replaced William Short as Jefferson's number 2. Short was Jefferson's right-hand man for 10 years, and then Jefferson goes back home, and a few years later, when Short comes back, Madison's there now, which is fine, but they had several disagreements, notably with, as I mentioned before, with France. They really wanted to be more friendly with France, and Short was like, "This is a bad idea, man. They are losing their heads over there. I get it, but because there were beheadings, a lot of them." And either way, he does kind of stay to himself until the end of Jefferson's presidency. Short is nominated for the first minister to Russia for the United States. So he goes to Russia. Unfortunately, it's at the end of Jefferson's presidency, and as there's an election coming up, the Senate doesn't confirm him, and then James Madison becomes president and doesn't renominate him. So William Short's in Europe, and suddenly he doesn't have a commission, so he's not getting paid. And he's like, what? Like, come on, guys. So he gets back on a boat and comes home, and he's unhappy, but he's still pretty filthy rich because he had been investing very wisely his whole life. Now, I do want to note that he pretty much retires from there, except William Short was one of the early abolitionists in the United States. And while certain northern states were getting rid of slavery, they still called it manumission. They were liberating their slaves, but abolition, from my impression anyway, was more of like, we all have to get rid of them. We can't just, this state or that state, we can't get rid of our own slaves. We have to get rid of everyone's slaves. And that's more or less what Short said. He was one of the few people at the time, even among abolitionists, who believed that black people and all people of color had the same mental facility that everyone else had. That whatever your skin color was, it doesn't matter, because we all have the opportunity to have the same mental fortitude. Granted, every human's different, and some people are super smart, and some of us are not quite. But that's all the individual. It has nothing to do with your skin color. And this is really ahead of its time. Him and you could say Dr. Benjamin Rush were pretty much on the same. The two founders really leading the way. Rufus King, I should mention. There were a few of them, but so I bring this up because he thought that not only should the slaves be liberated, but they should be given land so they could go start living. They weren't just thrown on the street, because there'd be thousands of poor people with no home all of a sudden, and that's a bad idea. Everyone could agree that's a pretty bad idea. And he wanted to help them acclimate their way into society. Now, unfortunately, this was not a very popular opinion. But what was started was a company that I'll probably make a whole video about. It was called the American Colonization Society. And it was a group of people who came together to help liberate African American slaves. And unfortunately, their decision was, we can't just set them free here. Well, let's form another colony in Africa. And they did. They actually created the country of Liberia, which is still around, and whose capital is still Monroeville, which was named after then-President James Monroe. Yes, it is the only other country in the world whose capital is named after an American president. Anywho, I bring it up because William Short did become president of this organization. Granted, like I said, it wasn't his ideal situation to resolve the problems, but he was a leader in the abolitionist movement. And the last thing I am going to say about William Short is he lived to be very old. He lived to be 90 years old. And he died in 1849 under, I believe, President Polk, who would have been the 10th president, I believe. We're getting a little out of my revolutionary, we'll say, expertise. I bring this up because he died 73 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. And this founder died just 11 years before the American Civil War. Which, I always like to bring up, implies that these aren't two separate events. History is, we like to break it up into separate segments, but it is one long train of events, as the Declaration of Independence likes to say. So, that is the summary of William Short, who I've condensed tremendously for this. He is an unbelievably important person for the work he did, mostly overseas, but back home too. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit like. That would be great. If you've just stumbled here and never seen my videos before, please hit subscribe. I put these out 5 days a week. And if you want to support me, please check out my Patreon page. I have a ton of fun stuff on there, and I'm considering starting a book club. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. I'm Jason. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.